Hello, thank you so much for having me. And I hope you've been enjoying the Global Biodiversity Festival 2022 so far. I'm Iris Berger and I'm a PhD student at the University of Cambridge. And I've been conducting expeditions across the tropics for almost a decade now. And usually I work in remote rainforests and savannas. But today I would like to talk about my PhD research in India, which actually involves working in agricultural landscapes a lot of the time. And you may think that sort of moving from rainforests to rice fields is a bit of a downgrade. Here's why I think the work is actually really exciting and important. And don't worry, I also still do work in rainforests as well. So basically, food security and biodiversity conservation need to be addressed simultaneously. Biodiversity is a necessity for food production and therefore human life. But at the same time, agriculture is the greatest extinction factor of birds, mammals, insects, plants in comparison to all other human activities. And navigating conflicts between agriculture and biodiversity conservation will be particularly challenging in India. So this is a map of how much of the world's the biosphere's productivity is for human use across the planet. And you can see that India has some of the most heavily used land on Earth in terms of supporting large rural population as well as large urban centres. And it has a very long history of using the land, particularly for agriculture. So the protection of existing native ecosystems is certainly extremely important, but significant expansion of the protected area network will be very challenging without compromising food security. So on the extreme end of the spectrum, devoting half of India's land to nature conservation, as it is proposed under the Harbour project, will lead to a significant loss of food calories, which is a big issue because India already has the highest absolute number of undernourished people on the planet. So it is important that sort of on-the-ground traditional, conservation actions such as protected areas and community-based conservation efforts are complemented with actions that actually address the root causes of biodiversity loss. And that includes India's unsustainable food system. So basically, we need major food system transformations to achieve food security with the least cost of biodiversity conservation. And this will have to involve both demand and supply side efforts. And increasing demand for food can be met in one or both two ways, by increasing the yields in areas that are already under production, or by increasing the area of the productive land. But that usually happens at the expense of natural habitats. And real-world experience suggests that both have been important in meeting rising demand for food over the last few decades. But they have both very significant but different impacts on biodiversity. So agriculture expansion and intensification don't have monotonic impacts on species abundance. So some species are tolerant of, or some even actually benefit from such changes. But other species are unable to persist in any agricultural landscapes, even those considered wildlife friendly, and they really need those sort of little pristine forests on the quotation marks, because most land is impacted by humans at this point, but they do need those native large expanses of native habitat. So by quantifying how species are affected by increasing agricultural intensification, we can work out whether it's better to spread farming over a larger area and sort of dilute its impact, or whether it's better to concentrate production on existing croplands and allow the protection of natural habitats elsewhere. And I mean, the thing is, we obviously ideally want to increase the biodiversity value of the agricultural land itself, but we really need to do this in a manner that doesn't compromise crop yield, because, like I said, all else being equal, we'd have to bring more land under production, usually at the expense of natural habitat. And biodiversity friendly practices such as retaining patches of native vegetations or using a few agrochemicals often tend to mean a lower crop yield. and therefore we need more land that can't be dedicated to nature conservation. That is actually critical for the persistence of many species. So field data so far suggests that the overall biodiversity outcomes are better if we increase productivity on existing farmlands and protect or restore native ecosystems elsewhere than if we're trying to integrate conservation and food production objectives in the same location by employing more wildlife friendly practices in the agricultural landscapes. So naturally, as a conservationist, I feel very uneasy about advocating for high intensity food production. Conventional agricultural intensification has really replaced ecological functions with external inputs such as agrochemicals and energy. And this has really contributed to the erosions of the functions and resulting ecosystem services such as crop pollination, nutrient cycling, and biological pest control. But the thing is, we're talking about increasing crop yields, and that does not have to mean conventional agricultural intensification, especially as these frequently undermine food production in the long term by being unsustainable and eroding these ecosystem services that we're talking about. So there are other ways to increase yield sustainably, or that's what we're actually trying to figure out at the moment. So ecological intensification involves amplifying ecosystem services to maintain or increase food production per unit area. And there's a focus on providing habitat and resources for the organisms underpinning these services that promote crop yield growth, such as the pollinators and natural enemies of crop pests. So the key question is whether we can identify farming systems that are both high yielding as well as wildlife friendly, and that support, not, of course, the organisms that provide these ecosystem services, such as the pollinators, but also species that don't contribute or don't benefit humans directly, but are important to conserve for their own sake. So I want to find out whether zero-budget natural farming, ZBNF, could potentially represent one of those farming systems in India. So zero-budget refers to the aim of drastically reducing the need for financial inputs and of ending farmers' reliance on external synthetic inputs and agricultural credits from big companies. And then natural farming refers to the agroecological basis on which these expenditure cuts are to be achieved. Actually, in fact, ZBNF represents one of the largest experiments in agroecology in the world. In short, ZBNF is supposed to improve soil health and consequently the efficiency of nutrient and water use. And really, farmers are reporting actually the same or oftentimes a higher yield than chemical farming. So a lot more data is needed to confirm this, and a lot more experiments need to be conducted. Other than that, also multi-cropping and the planting of natural fences are encouraged as well. So my research is ultimately split into two parts. So the first part is about gaining a better understanding of the on-farm biodiversity that actually contributes to food production and whether it can support sustainable increases in crop yield. And the second part is about conserving biodiversity for its own sake and assessing whether ZBNF can overall benefit biodiversity conservation. So it's about identifying the trade-offs between conservation and agriculture that I've been talking about. So far, no one has actually looked into the effect of ZBNF on pollinators and the benefits it provides to crop yield. So I'm comparing ZBNF cashew farms with cashew farms that do use pesticides and other agrochemicals. So basically, I've spent a lot of time staring at cashew flowers and looking at which insects, so bees, butterflies, and flies, and other insects, are visiting those. And whenever I can't identify a particular insect in the field, I have to collect it to later identify the lab. So I've been frantically running past butterflies, much to the amusement of local farmers. And I've only just finished my first season, so I have to work through a lot of data and do some fancy maths first before I can talk about any findings. My preliminary feeling from the data, from my observations, seems that there are more pollinators in the ZBNF cashew farms. But like I said, we'll have to wait, unfortunately, until next year to see whether that's really the case. And apart from these observations of the pollinators visiting, I've also tried to actually directly quantify the contribution of pollinators to cashew yield by putting these sort of mosquito net bags around the cashew branches. You can see in the photo at the bottom. And that's artificially excluding the pollinators, and then I can see what happens to crop yield if there are no pollinators. So this, however, is where the agriculture biodiversity relationship is getting even more complicated, because both are affected by the climate crisis. And unusually late rains at the end of last year have created conditions that were favorable for a black fungus that has really, along with some insect pests as well, really destroyed the crop yield this year. So the farmers have been only reporting about a tenth of the cashew yield that they normally get. So on the least serious note, this probably meant that my pollinator exclusion experiments were not very informative this year. But I think this is really just the start of the impact of the climate crisis on agriculture, because India is at the forefront of the climate crisis, and global climate changes associated with extreme weather events. Even, I think you might have seen in the news, the extreme heat waves that are currently occurring in India will become even more common and impact food production across India. So India's food system needs to really be reshaped about adaptation to sort of instill resilience, and reshaped about mitigation to reduce greenhouse gas emissions as well. And ultimately, the relationship between food, biodiversity, and climate are very complex, with sort of synergies and trade-offs between the three of them. But it is important that the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis are addressed simultaneously in India, as well as globally. So if climate change adaptation is addressed in synchrony with climate change mitigation and biodiversity conservation, and so trade-offs can be minimized and the sort of best outcomes achieved overall. So more data is needed in this, but to confirm this, but it does seem like ZBNF may be more climate resilient because it improves soil health and reduces water usage. And it is also likely to have lower greenhouse gas emissions as well. So my research doesn't actually explicitly focus on the climate crisis, but climate change is nonetheless very likely to actually impact the outcomes of my study as well, because it's likely to affect the crop yield of the different farm systems and how they fare under changing weather patterns. And it will also likely alter how different species use different habitats and agricultural landscapes as well. So the second part of my PhD is about identifying what kinds of farming provide the food we need, yet give the best outcomes for biodiversity, with birds as my focal point. And I focus on birds because they're relatively easy to study, and they can act as an indicator for other texts as well. And the thing is, we know quite a lot how different landscapes are affecting wildlife, but this is misleading without information on crop yields as well, because it doesn't allow us to find how given food demand can be met with the least cost to biodiversity conservation. So to answer the question, we need data on the abundance of individual species in matched landscapes that vary only in the degree of agricultural development. So from your wild nature, the pristine rainforests, all the way through wildlife-friendly farming. So for example, ZBNF with a lot of sort of habitat patches and trees embedded in the landscape, to very intensive farming where you don't find any trees and a lot of chemicals used. And crucially, we also need the crop yield of these. Because, I'm interested in the effect of the farming practice, so ZBNF versus conventional farming, chemical-based farming, as well as sort of the amount of the natural habitat patches embedded in the landscape, from individual trees to larger patches, native vegetations. And both factors are likely to impact yield, because, for example, if you take some land out of production to dedicate to natural habitats, you use some yield, but then maybe you find more birds, for example, in the landscape. So it will, in complex, I'm sure in very complex ways, it affects the crop yield as well as the bird community as well. So for each farming practice, ZBNF versus chemical, I have a gradient of sites to differ in the amount of these natural habitat patches. And at each site, identify and count birds visually with my binoculars, often, as well as from the calls. And I do the same in the forest as well. And in the forest, because it's very dense and very hard to actually observe the birds directly, about 70 or 90% of my observations are acoustic only. So I do record the calls as well, so you can go over the recordings at a later time and check with experts if I need to. And like I promised at the start, I do work still in the rainforest and quite inaccessible sites as well. So the thing is, birds are active very early in the morning. So to get to my forest sites in time for the dawn forest, I have to walk for at least an hour in darkness, whacking myself through the forest with machetes because there's usually no paths, and hoping not to disturb any snakes as well. And I'm currently still collecting the data, and in fact I'm actually going back into the field tomorrow again. So again, I can't talk about any exciting research findings just yet. You'll have to wait until next year for that. But ultimately, I will put the data into a mathematical model where I fix the food production target and I let the model figure out how the density of different bird species can be maximized while meeting that food demand. So it will ultimately tell me how much land can be dedicated to the different farming systems. So how much can be ZBNF with a lot of habitat patches, for example, how much do we need to retain the chemical farming because it is actually the highest yielding after all, and it allows us to spare some of the land for the forest. So yeah, I will update you again at the Global Biodiversity Festival next year, and hopefully it will give some insights into how to resolve these conflicts between agriculture and conservation in India. So with that, thank you so much for listening. Please shoot any questions at me. If anything arises later on, please contact me over email or social media. And with that, I will leave you.